So in this chapter, we will study some of the major endocrine system dysfunctions. Alterations can occur with significant increase or decrease of hormones, whether that is hypersecretion or hyposecretion. The increase or decrease of hormone can come on very quickly or occur slowly over a long period of time. As was mentioned in Chapter 18 regarding receptor numbers being important in hormone regulation, hormone dysfunction can be due to a lack or too much of a hormone, as well as an issue with the receptor. So if the receptor is downgraded, you won't have use of that hormone, even if the hormone is being produced normally. So here are your objectives. I've tried to outline them in a fair amount of detail, but what you want to do is keep these present as you go through the lecture notes, and then also take into account what might be on the quiz that will be next week, as well as the assignment that will be coming up. While it's important to know the basis of why a disease develops and what occurs with the disease, you also want to think about the whole picture in terms of the patient. And if a patient has X different signs and symptoms, what disease might be occurring. All right. With this figure, figure 19.1, what it shows is that intimate relationship between hypothalamus function and the pituitary function. Abnormal hypothalamus function is often seen with pituitary issues. And that's the point of this slide, to show you the fact that if the hypothalamus has decreased function, so decreased gonadotropin-releasing hormone, thyroid-releasing hormone, all right, those are going to have a direct effect on the pituitary. And so decreased gonadotropin-releasing hormone acting on the pituitary, there is less follicle-stimulating hormone, or decreased luteinizing hormone. Same with the decrease in the thyroid-releasing hormone, there is less thyroid-stimulating hormone released by the pituitary. So I think I mentioned this in Chapter 18. When a disorder comes around, it is difficult to know immediately where the problem is. If it is an issue, so if you have a thyroid issue, and I had a thyroid issue, we got lab results back that said I didn't have any TSH. All right, right here. My TSH was at 0, all right, not detectable. It was below, well, it wasn't below 0, but it was not even detectable. It was so low. And this was, I don't know, 18 years ago. 18 years ago this summer. And the doctor said, well, TSH is produced by the pituitary. And so then I went home and told my husband this, and so my husband said, oh, well, then what's wrong with your pituitary? And in the end, really, there actually isn't anything wrong with either or any of the glands involved, the hypothalamus, the pituitary, the thyroid, but rather I was developing an autoimmune disorder where my thyroid was being overstimulated. All right, but to say that, I had that initial blood test, but then I had to have other tests done to actually figure that out. So it's not just a one test tells you what the problem is. All right, moving on to the actual diseases. All right, this is an example of hypopituitary dwarfism. So looking at the pituitary and what happens if that is not functioning properly. Hypopituitary can be caused by a structural or functional issue of the pituitary or the hypothalamus. There could be an issue with the hypothalamus producing the correct hormone to stimulate the pituitary, or the pituitary stalk. The direct link of communication between the hypothalamus and the pituitary could also be damaged. Or then, excuse me, or then the pituitary could have an issue preventing normal function or normal production of the proper hormones. In this case, with hypopituitary dwarfism, the pituitary is not producing enough growth hormone. Therefore, the child over here just doesn't see, or doesn't grow, and doesn't see in this picture because its eyes are covered up. So what you have is a 4-year-old girl, normal height of about 39 inches, and then a 4-year-old boy who is just 25 inches. He would be classified a pituitary dwarf. And what you notice, I mean, you wouldn't think that this kid was 4 years old, but rather maybe a 2-year-old, or I don't know, an 18-month-old. That had nothing wrong with him because there's normal proportions between the head, the trunk, and the limbs. Unlike what you would see in some other genetic forms of dwarfism, where the trunk size might be normal, but the head is out of proportion and the limbs are shorter relative to the trunk. So the child just simply doesn't grow. And it is not an issue of just having short stature. In this case, well, it is an issue of just short stature. Hormone therapy could be given to this child, growth hormone injections, if it can't be figured out why the pituitary is not producing enough growth hormones. So this is not just an example, or isn't an example of just a short child. All right, there would definitely be ethical dilemmas if you and your spouse were just normally on the short side and you wanted a tall child, and so you asked the pediatrician, "Oh, please, pretty please, can we give our child growth hormones to make him taller or her taller?" All right, ethical issues there, yes. In this case, this child has a physical issue within its body that is not allowing his body to produce growth hormones. So in this case, I would not see an ethical question of allowing that child to receive growth hormone injections. Next, and this might be slightly out of order with your textbook, but it goes along well with the hypopituitary dwarfism. Here you have a pituitary giant, as well as a pituitary dwarf. So here you have two normal height men. You know, let's go with, say, 5'10". Maybe, who knows how tall this door is. But this is a pituitary dwarf. Again, he just looks short. Normal proportions between the trunk of the body, the arms, and the head. Here you have a pituitary giant. Obviously, very tall. Also an issue with abnormal growth hormone secretion, in this case, too much. The difference between the pituitary giant and a person with acromegaly, which we'll see on the next slide, and I think that's where the out of order issue comes from, is when there's too much growth hormone secreted in this guy prior to the epiphyseal plates closing. All right. If there's too much growth hormone secreted before those epiphyseal plates close, a person will become a giant. If the epiphyseal plates have closed, the condition of acromegaly will develop, and we'll talk about that more on the next slide. I heard a public speaker talk about Goliath, good old David and Goliath, having a pituitary disorder. He is noted in the Bible as being over 9 feet tall. This is quite normal for a pituitary giant to be 8 to 9 feet tall. It has been suggested that President Lincoln, who was also excessively tall, may have also been a pituitary giant. Now, here is acromegaly. Acromegaly is too much growth hormone secretion, just like in the previous slide, but in this case, it's going to occur after the epiphyseal plates have closed. So later in life, is there an issue with the pituitary secreting too much growth hormone? So what might cause this hypersecretion occurring later in life? Big one is going to be an adenoma. right? A benign, generally benign tumor of the pituitary gland. For whatever reason, this is seen more often in women, and the disease is actually very slow in developing. And you don't have to have a lot of extra growth hormone for this to happen, but rather after those ephesioplates close, you naturally have a decrease of growth hormone being produced, if any. And so then even slight upregulations of that growth hormone, when there shouldn't be, can cause this disease. So it is very slow developing, and it's typically going to be diagnosed in the 4th or 5th decade of life. What happens is because those ephesioplates have already closed, you can't have an increase in the length of the bone, so rather the bones just start to get bigger themselves, and really it's more in mass and being thicker. And you typically see these in the face, the hands, and the feet. So although we don't have anything normal to compare it to, just looking at the size of this person's ears, he has a very long face and a very wide jaw. So this is a very extreme case of acromegaly. Other bones may have slight increases, but you don't see that as obvious because there's a lot of muscle mass covering the bone. The major issue, and you can see some other signs and symptoms or symptoms of the disease here. Skin tags developing, very large spade-like hands. There can be issues with edema, and that can be body-wide. But then you also have this frontal losing and transfrontal scar. The other issue that you don't see is the issue on the cardiovascular system, and that's really the major issue. And it's not clear exactly why the extra growth hormone causes such a major issue on the cardiovascular system, but it's just known. 1/3 to 1/2 of these patients will develop chronic and severe hypertension and left ventricular failure. And really because of the cardiovascular involvement, these patients, individuals, will have a decrease or do have a decrease life expectancy. All right, and this is where we're actually going to stop for part 1 because the thyroid issues will probably take 10 to 15 minutes in itself.